He had 5 minutes to stop the woman he loved from disappearing forever. The train was already moving, and he hadn't even told her how he felt. Silas Vance wasn't the kind of man who chased trains. He fixed fences. He broke horses. He carried the weight of a failing ranch on shoulders that had learned to bear silence like armor. But on that autumn afternoon in 2004, in Bozeman, Montana, he pushed his charcoal gelding harder than he'd ever dared, hooves hammering the hard-packed earth like a war drum counting down to the end of everything. Through the haze of dust and steam, he could see her, Eleanor, standing at the edge of the platform, one hand gripping the iron railing of the passenger car. She was seconds from stepping into a life that would take her 3,000 miles away from him, from the only chance they'd ever have. The train's whistle split the valley like a scream. Silas didn't slow down. He couldn't, because in 5 minutes the woman who'd made him believe in something beyond survival would be gone, and he'd spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd ever really been brave or just good at pretending. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, 23 years old, eyes that had seen too much concrete and not enough sky. She'd come to Montana 6 months earlier with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like it was suffocating in a city that never stopped moving. She wasn't running to something. She was running from everything, the cramped apartment, where the walls pressed in like a slow burial, the subway platforms where thousands of people moved past each other like ghosts, the job that paid her just enough to keep her trapped. She'd read about big sky country in a magazine left behind at a laundromat, and something in those photographs of endless horizon had whispered, "You don't have to disappear to survive." So she'd bought a one-way ticket west and convinced herself she was choosing freedom. For 6 months, she worked at a roadside diner on the outskirts of Bozeman, serving coffee to ranchers with hands like leather and waitresses with faces carved by wind and time. She rented a tiny apartment above a hardware store. She learned the rhythm of a place where the loudest sound at night was the wind moving through the pines. And she met Silas Vance. He was a ranch hand, 31, a man who spoke in sentences that felt weighed before they left his mouth. He had a way of looking at her, not like a stranger, not like a waitress, but like someone who recognized that she was standing in the wrong place, waiting for permission to stay. They never dated, they never even came close. 3 months of almost conversations, almost confessions, almost reasons to believe that Montana could be more than just a place she was hiding. But Silas never asked her to stay, and Eleanor never found the courage to tell him she was leaving. Until now. Her savings were gone, winter was closing in, and the train ticket tucked into the pocket of her denim jacket was her surrender in paper form, a one-way ride back to the life she'd tried so hard to escape. You ever been seconds away from losing something you didn't even know you needed? That moment when you realize the thing you've been taking for granted, the person, the place, the chance, is about to slip through your fingers, and there's nothing you can do to stop time from moving forward. That's where Eleanor was standing, on a train platform in Montana, watching the last 5 months of her life reduced down to a choice between safety and the terrifying possibility that she might actually matter to someone. And that's where Silas was riding, pushing his horse past the point of reason because he'd spent 3 months being careful, being respectful, being the kind of man who didn't ask for things he couldn't promise to protect, and now he was out of time. This story, it's about that moment, the one where you either step forward or spend the rest of your life looking back. Don't let this story slip by. Hit subscribe because what happens next changes everything. Not just for Eleanor, not just for Silas, but for everyone who's ever stood at a crossroads and convinced themselves that walking away was the safer choice. You need to see how this ends. You need to know whether courage wins or whether fear gets the final word, because somewhere in your own life you've got a train platform waiting. Decision you've been avoiding, a person you've been too scared to reach for. And when that moment comes, and it will, you're going to need to remember what happened. Here in Bozeman, Montana in the autumn of 2004, when a cowboy stopped a woman from boarding a train and asked her to give him a chance. So subscribe right now, because the people who scroll past this, they're the same ones who let the train leave, and they spend the next 20 years wondering what would have happened if they'd just been brave enough to stay. 6 months earlier, the Greyhound bus had dropped a Eleanor at the edge of Bozeman, just as the sun was setting. Behind the Gallatin Range, she stepped off onto gravel that crunched under her boots. Breathing air so clean it almost hurt. The sky was bigger than anything she'd ever seen, not framed by buildings or cut into strips by power lines, but stretched out in every direction like the world had finally exhaled. She had $1,100 in her checking account, 2 suitcases full of clothes that didn't belong in Montana, and a phone number for a motel that rented rooms by the week. That first night, she sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a room that smelled like pine cleaner and cigarette smoke someone had tried to cover up. She stared out the window at the mountains, dark and massive against the fading light, and she cried, not because she regretted leaving, but because she didn't know if running away from one kind of loneliness meant she'd just traded it for another. Back east, she'd been surrounded by millions of people and had never felt more invisible. Here, she was alone in a way that was absolute. No roommates, no coworkers she'd grab drinks with. Out of obligation, no subway crowds to get lost in, just her, the wind, and the realization that freedom and isolation were separated by a line so thin you didn't notice it until you'd already crossed over. She found work 3 days later at a diner called the Cottonwood Cafe, a low-slung building with faded yellow siding and a gravel parking lot that turned to mud when it rained. The owner, a woman named Diane with gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, hired her on the spot. "You ever worked a grill before?" Diane asked, not looking up from the register. "No, ma'am." "You got a problem with early mornings?" "No, ma'am." "You planning on staying? Or are you one of those girls who shows up thinking Montana's gonna fix whatever's broken and then leaves the second winter hits?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't have an answer. Diane seemed to take the silence as honesty, because she tossed an apron across the counter and said, "Shifts start at 5:30. Don't be late." The work was hard in a way Eleanor had never experienced, not the soul-crushing, meaningless grind of data entry and fluorescent-lit cubicles, but the kind of tired that came from being on your feet for 10 hours, pouring coffee for men whose hands were scarred from barbed wire and whose faces rarely smiled, but sometimes softened when you remembered how they took their eggs. She learned the names. Hank, who ran cattle on the North Ridge and never spoke more than 3 words unless his dog was with him. Carol, who worked at the feed store and always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no cream, and a slice of pie she never finished. Old Jean, who'd been coming to the Cottonwood since before Diane owned it, and who liked to tell stories about the winter of '78 when the snow got so deep they had to dig tunnels to the barn. Eleanor listened. She poured. She wiped down tables and refilled ketchup bottles and learned that in a place like this, silence wasn't rude. It was respectful. People didn't talk just to fill the air. They talked when they had something worth saying. She counted stars instead of subway stops now, but the silence was louder than any city street. At night, she'd walk back to her apartment above the hardware store, climb the narrow wooden stairs and sit by the window with a cup of tea she'd let go cold. The mountains were always there, watching, permanent, unbothered by her existence. She'd come to Montana thinking the bigness of it would make her feel free, but instead it made her feel small. Not in a bad way. Just honest. She didn't matter here. Not yet, maybe not ever. And somehow that was both terrifying and the most relief she'd felt in years. 3 months in, she'd saved enough to buy a second-hand winter coat from the thrift store and a pair of boots that actually fit. She'd stopped flinching every time the diner door opened. She'd learned to make conversation without forcing it, to read the weather by the way the clouds sat on the peaks, to understand that "I'll think about it" from a rancher meant no, and maybe meant ask again in a week. She was starting to belong. And that's when Silas Vance's truck broke down outside the diner. It was a Tuesday, mid-afternoon. The lunch rush had cleared out and Eleanor was wiping down the counter when she heard the sputter and cough of an engine giving up. She looked through the window and saw a dusty blue Chevy rolling to a stop in the parking lot, smoke curling from under the hood. A man got out, tall, broad-shouldered in the way that came from work, not a gym. He was wearing a sweat-stained Stetson, a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and jeans that had seen better years. He stood there for a second, staring at the truck like he was deciding whether to kick it or pray over it, and then he walked toward the diner. The bell above the door chimed. Eleanor looked up, and Silas Vance looked at her like he just found something he didn't know he'd been searching for. He didn't say anything at first, just took off his hat, ran a hand through dark hair that needed a cut, and gave her a nod that felt more like an acknowledgement than a greeting. "Coffee?" Eleanor asked. "Please." His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. She poured, slid the cup across the counter. He wrapped both hands around it like he needed the warmth, even though it was 70 degrees outside. "Truck give out?" she asked. "Radiator," he said, "3rd time this month. You gonna fix it or shoot it?" The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "Haven't decided yet." That was the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Silas came into the diner 4 more times. Never for a meal, always just coffee. He'd sit at the counter, drink it slow, and leave a $5 bill even though the coffee was $2.50. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words felt like they'd been measured on a scale. Once he mentioned the ranch, told her it had been in his family since his grandfather bought it in the 30s, told her the land was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and that keeping it alive felt like trying to hold water in your hands. "Sounds hard," Eleanor had said. "It is. So why stay?" He'd looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, Eleanor felt like someone saw her, not the version of herself she was trying to build, but the one who was still scared, still running, still hopping that somewhere somehow she'd find a reason to stop. "Because leaving's easier," Silas had said, "and easy things don't tend to be worth much." A week later, Eleanor bought the train ticket. She told herself it was practical. Winter was coming, her savings were running out. The diner didn't pay enough to cover rent and food once the snow hit. She had no family in Montana. No real friends. No reason to believe that staying would lead to anything but more loneliness in a colder season. She told herself all of that. But the real reason she bought the ticket was because Silas Vance had started to feel like a reason to stay, and that terrified her more than going back to the city ever could. Here's the truth. Most people won't admit. We don't leave because the place is wrong. We don't pack our bags and buy tickets because the job doesn't pay enough, or because the apartment is too small, or because the weather's too cold. We leave because we're terrified we might actually belong somewhere. We leave because belonging means roots, and roots mean you can't run anymore. Roots mean that if it falls apart, if it doesn't work out, if the person you're starting to care about decides you're not worth the trouble, you're going to feel it, all of it, the kind of pain that doesn't have an escape hatch. Eleanor bought that train ticket because staying in Montana meant admitting that she wanted something, and wanting something, really wanting it, meant she could lose it. So she chose the train. She chose the known misery of a city that had never cared about her, over the unknown possibility that a cowboy with kind eyes and careful words might actually see her as someone worth keeping. And if you're watching this right now, wondering if you've ever run from the right thing, you already know the answer. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That job you quit before they could promote you. Because what if you failed? That relationship you ended before it got serious because what if they left first? That dream you buried because chasing it meant you might have to face the fact that you're not as brave as you pretend to be. We all do it. We all board trains that take us back to lives we've outgrown because at least we know how to survive there. At least disappointment is familiar. But here's what nobody tells you. 20 years from now, you won't remember the risks you didn't take as safe choices. You'll remember them as the moments you gave up on yourself. Subscribe now, because the people who ignore that feeling, they're the ones who spend the rest of their lives wondering what if. They're the ones who, at 53, still think about the person they didn't fight for, the place they didn't stay, the version of themselves they were too scared to become. And if subscription feels like too much commitment for a YouTube channel, I need you to ask yourself something. If you can't commit to clicking a button that costs you nothing, how are you ever going to commit to the things that actually matter? Eleanor was standing on that platform with a ticket in her pocket, convincing herself that going back east was the responsible choice, the smart choice, the safe choice. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't being responsible. She was being a coward. And maybe that's harsh. Maybe you think I'm being too hard on her, but I'm not talking about Eleanor anymore, am I? I'm talking about you. The you who's watching this video right now, thinking about the thing you walked away from, the person you let go, the life you convinced yourself you didn't deserve. So here's what I need you to do. If you're still with me, if this story is hitting somewhere you didn't expect, hit subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because you need to prove to yourself that you're capable of choosing something, even when it scares you. And if you still won't click that button, drop a comment, tell me why, tell me what's so scary about committing to stories that might actually change how you see your own life. Tell me why you're afraid to click a button when Eleanor's about to risk everything. Because in 5 minutes she's going to have to make a choice, and so are you. Have you ever run from something, only to realize you were running toward the wrong thing? That question sat in Eleanor's chest like a stone as she stood on the platform of the Bozeman Depot, waiting for the northbound train that would carry her back to everything she'd sworn she'd never return to. The morning had started gray, cold, the kind of cold that bit at your fingertips and made your breath hang in the air like something you could grab onto. Eleanor had woken up at 4:30, stared at the ceiling of her tiny apartment for 20 minutes, and then forced herself out of bed before doubt could root her in place. She'd packed the night before, 2 scuffed suitcases, the same one she'd arrived with 6 months ago, only now they felt heavier, not because she'd accumulated more things, but because leaving always weighs more than arriving. She didn't eat breakfast. Her stomach was twisted too tight. She made coffee, poured it into a travel mug, and then left it on the counter untouched. She walked down the narrow wooden stairs from her apartment, the steps creaking under her boots, and stepped out into the Pre-dawn darkness. Main Street was empty. The hardware store below her apartment was still locked up. The only light came from the diner down the road, where Diane was probably already flipping on the grill, getting ready for the ranchers who'd start rolling in by 6. Eleanor thought about stopping in, saying goodbye, but she couldn't, because if she walked into that diner and saw the regulars, Hank with his 3-word sentences, Carol with her unfinished pie, old Gene with his stories about winters that tried to kill him, she might not leave. And she'd already made her choice, hadn't she? She loaded her suitcases into the trunk of the cab she'd called the night before. The driver was a man in his 60s with a face like crumpled paper and a Garth Brooks song playing low on the radio. He didn't ask questions, just pulled out onto the empty road and drove. The sun started to rise as they headed toward the depot, gold light spilling over the mountains, turning the frost on the fields into something that looked like crushed diamonds. Montana had never looked more beautiful than it did on the morning Eleanor decided to leave it. The depot wasn't much, a single-story building with peeling paint and a wooden platform that had seen better decades. There were a handful of other passengers waiting, a couple with 2 small kids who kept running in circles, an older woman reading a paperback, a man in a business suit checking his watch every 30 seconds like he could make the train arrive faster. Eleanor set her suitcases down near the edge of the platform. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of pine and distant smoke from someone's wood stove. She pulled her denim jacket tighter and shoved her hands into her pockets. Her fingers brushed against the ticket. The edges were soft now. She'd been thumbing it nervously for 2 days. She looked down the tracks. They stretched out into the distance, 2 silver lines cutting through the valley, stitching the earth together in a way that felt both permanent and fragile. Somewhere out there the train was coming, and when it arrived she'd step on. She'd find a seat by the window. She'd watch Montana disappear behind her, mile by mile, until it was nothing but a memory she could tuck away and pretend didn't hurt. That was the plan. But plans have a way of falling apart when your heart's not in them. Eleanor checked her watch. 15 minutes until the train was scheduled to arrive. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her boots scraped against the gravel. She looked toward the main road, the one that led back into town, the one Silas would take if he were coming from the ranch. Empty. Of course it was empty. Why would he come? She hadn't told him she was leaving, hadn't said goodbye, hadn't given him any reason to think she wanted him to stop her. And he hadn't asked her to stay. That was the part that stung the most. 3 months of almosts, and he'd never once said the words she needed to hear, never once suggested that her leaving would matter to him. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe she'd been reading too much into the way he looked at her, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way he always left that $5 bill even though the coffee was only $2.50. Maybe she'd invented the whole thing in her head, because she was lonely and desperate and so damn tired of feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. A tumbleweed rolled across the road, slow, aimless, like it had all the time in the world and nowhere to be. Eleanor watched it disappear into the sagebrush on the other side. She felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, just splintering, the kind of hurt that doesn't make noise but leaves a mark you'll carry forever. She picked up her suitcases. Her knuckles were white against the handles. This is the right choice, she whispered to herself. You can't stay somewhere just because you're scared to leave. You can't build a life on maybes. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Because the truth she'd been running from since the moment she bought that ticket was that she wasn't leaving because Montana didn't work out. She was leaving because it was starting to, and that was more terrifying than anything the city had ever thrown at her. In the city she'd been numb, invisible, safe in her irrelevance. Here she mattered, or at least she was starting to, and if she stayed, if she let herself hope, if she let herself believe that Silas Vance saw her as something more than a waitress passing through. What happened when it fell apart? What happened when winter got hard and the money ran out and he realized she didn't know the first thing about this life? What happened when she wasn't enough? Better to leave now, better to control the ending. The train whistle screamed in the distance. Eleanor's breath caught. The sound echoed through the valley, low and mournful, like the mountains themselves were mourning something they hadn't lost yet. She turned toward the tracks. A thin line of black smoke was rising above the ridge to the south. The train was close, maybe 3 minutes out. Her heart started to hammer against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment. In 3 minutes, the steel beast would pull into the station, hissing and groaning, and the conductor would call for boarding, and she'd step onto that train and her life in Montana would be over. She looked at the road one more time. Still empty. No dust cloud, no truck, no charcoal gelding racing toward her like something out of a movie. Just wind and sagebrush and the slow, inevitable pull of a life she'd already resigned herself to. Eleanor closed her eyes. She felt the sting of tears she refused to let fall. "Goodbye, Silas," she whispered to no one. And then she opened her eyes, adjusted her grip on the suitcases, and prepared to board a train that would take her as far from home as she'd ever been. The train didn't just arrive. It announced itself like a judgment. First came the vibration, a deep, rhythmic trembling that started in the rails and traveled up through the wooden planks of the platform, through the soles of Eleanor's boots, into her bones. Then came the sound, not just the whistle, but the grind of steel wheels against track, the hiss of steam releasing in angry bursts, the mechanical breathing of something massive and unstoppable. The ground shook. The air thickened with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. Eleanor watched it come around the bend, a dark shape growing larger against the golden morning light. The locomotive was black and scarred, its paint chipped from years of crossing these mountains. Steam billowed from its sides like breath from a living thing. It was beautiful in a brutal way, powerful, indifferent. It didn't care if she got on or not. It would leave either way. The other passengers started gathering their bags, moving toward the edge of the platform. The couple with the kids corralled them into something resembling a line. The businessman adjusted his tie. The older woman folded her paperback and tucked it into her purse. Eleanor picked up her suitcases. They felt impossibly heavy now, like they were filled with all the words she'd never said, all the chances she'd never taken, all the versions of herself she'd buried because it was easier than fighting for them. The train slowed as it approached the station. Brakes squealed. Metal screamed against metal. The massive wheels locked and skidded the last few feet, sending sparks scattering across the gravel. The whole thing shuddered to a stop, hissing like a dragon settling into sleep. For a moment, everything was still. And then the conductor appeared. He was a man in his late 60s with a face like old leather, and eyes that had seen 1,000 departures and didn't care about one more. He stepped down from the passenger car, checked his pocket watch with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, and cleared his throat. "Bozeman," his voice cut through the morning air, sharp and final. "All aboard for the northbound line, transferring in Minneapolis. This train departs in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. Eleanor's chest tightened. She took a step forward, then another. The gravel crunched under her boots. Each step felt like a betrayal, not of Montana, of herself. She reached the stairs leading up to the passenger car. The iron railing was cold under her palm. She could see inside, rows of seats upholstered in faded green fabric, overhead racks For luggage, windows streaked with dirt and years. It looked exactly like the train she'd taken. When she first ran away from the east, same smell, same tired, desperate energy of people, trying to get somewhere else. She put one foot on the bottom step. "Ma'am, you boarding or not?" The conductor was looking at her with the kind of impatience that came from running on a schedule that didn't bend for anyone's indecision. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Because somewhere behind her, beneath the hiss of the idling engine and the murmur of other passengers, she heard something that didn't belong. Hooves. Fast, frantic, pounding the earth with a rhythm that was desperate and uneven and completely out of place at a train depot in 2004. She froze, her hand tightened on the railing, her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt. No, it couldn't be. She turned her head slowly, afraid that if she moved too fast the sound would disappear and she'd realize she'd imagined the whole thing. But it wasn't her imagination. Through the veil of steam still rising from the train, through the golden dust kicked up by the morning wind, she saw him. Silas Vance. Not in his truck, on horseback. The charcoal gelding was lathered in sweat, its sides heaving, its breath coming in heavy white plumes that hung in the cold air. Silas was pushing the animal harder than he should have, faster than was safe on ground this uneven. His Stetson was pulled low, but she could see the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins like he was holding onto the last thing that mattered. He wasn't slowing down. He was riding straight for the platform like the devil himself was chasing him. Eleanor's breath caught. The suitcase slipped from her other hand and hit the gravel with a dull thud. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare as Silas Vance closed the distance between them at a pace that looked reckless to anyone who didn't understand what was at stake. 50 yards. 30. 20. He pulled the horse to a sliding halt at the edge of the platform, gravel spraying, the animals' hooves skidding on the hard-packed dirt. Silas didn't wait for the gelding to settle. He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the ground hard, his spurs jingling with a sharp metallic urgency that cut through every other sound in the world. He'd ridden straight from the high pastures. She could see it in the dust on his jeans, the sweat on his face, the way his shirt was stained dark across the shoulders. He looked like he'd been working since dawn, like he'd dropped everything the second he'd realized what day it was. Eleanor. Her name came out like a gunshot, not angry, desperate. The conductor looked over, annoyed now. "Ma'am, we're on a schedule. You're either on or you're off. I can't hold the line for." "Just give me a minute," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "You don't have a minute. You've got 30 seconds before I close this door." Silas stepped onto the platform. He was only 10 feet away now, close enough that she could see the grit and sweat on his face, the way his chest was rising and falling like he'd been the one running instead of the horse, close enough that she could see the look in his eyes, raw and unguarded in a way she'd never seen from him before. "You weren't gonna say goodbye." His voice was low, rough, like the words were scraping their way out of him. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, not clean, jagged. "I didn't think it would matter, Silas." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "The ranch. The debt. You've got enough to worry about without a girl who doesn't even know how to ride a horse properly." The train gave a sudden lurch. The brakes released with a hiss of compressed air. The wheels groaned, beginning their slow rotation. "Step back, son," the conductor barked at Silas. "This train is leaving." But Silas didn't move. He took another step forward, closing the gap between them to nothing. His hand hovered near hers on the railing, but he didn't grab it. Even now, even in this moment. He was giving her the space to choose. "I spent all morning up on the North Ridge," he said, his eyes locked on hers, looking out over the valley, thinking about winter coming on, and for the first time in my life, Eleanor, the idea of that quiet didn't feel like peace. His voice cracked, just barely, just enough. "It felt like a ghost town, because I knew you wouldn't be at the diner when I rode in. I knew I wouldn't see your light on in that apartment over the hardware store. I knew I'd spend the next 40 years looking at that counter, where you used to pour coffee and wondering why the hell I never told you the truth." The train lurched again, harder this time. The wheels were moving now, slow but gaining momentum. The conductor grabbed the door handle. "Last call, miss. Romance doesn't stop trains. You're in or you're out." Eleanor looked at Sela's, then at the open door of the passenger car, then back at Sela's. The world collapsed down to the few inches of cold Montana air between them. Everything she'd run from was on that train: safety, predictability, the comfort of knowing exactly how small her life would be. Everything she was terrified to want was standing right in front of her, offering nothing but honesty and hard work, and a view that wouldn't pay the bills. "Don't get on that train, Eleanor." Silas's voice was barely audible over the grinding of the wheels, the hiss of steam, the screaming of metal against track. "Not yet. I know I haven't got much to offer right now, but a lot of hard work and a future that's not guaranteed, but I'm asking you." He stopped, swallowed hard, and then said the words he'd been carrying for 3 months. "Give me a chance. Give us a chance to see what this is before you go back to a life that doesn't fit you anymore." The train was moving, slowly but moving. The stairs were sliding past her. The conductor was yelling something she couldn't hear over the roar of blood in her ears. And Eleanor Hayes stood on the edge of the platform, one hand still on the railing of a train that was leaving without her permission, and made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Before we go any further into what happened next, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it. 2. To understand why Eleanor almost got on that train, you have to understand what she was running from. Philadelphia, August 2004. The apartment she'd lived in for 3 years had windows that faced a brick wall, not a building, with interesting architecture or fire escapes where people hung plants or sat smoking cigarettes. Just brick, red and brown and gray, stained with years of rain and exhaust fumes close enough that if she opened the window and reached out, she could touch it. She'd wake up every morning at 6:15 to the sound of her upstairs neighbor's alarm going off. The walls were thin enough that she could hear him hit snooze 3 times before finally dragging himself out of bed. She could hear his shower running, his coffee maker beeping, his door slamming as he left for whatever job he worked that started before 7. Then silence. The kind of silence that somehow felt louder than noise. Eleanor would lie there in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling with its water stain that looked like a map of someplace she'd never been, and feel the weight of another day pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. Her job was at a marketing firm downtown. She was a junior coordinator, which meant she answered phones, scheduled meetings for people who didn't remember her name, and organized files that no one would ever look at again. The office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower that reflected the sky but never let any real light in. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead. The air conditioning was always too cold. Her desk was in a cubicle that didn't have walls high enough to give her privacy, but was just tall enough that she couldn't see out. She'd eat lunch alone, A salad from the place downstairs that tasted like plastic and cost $12. She'd scroll through her phone, looking at pictures of places she'd never go and lives. She'd never live, and then she'd go back to her desk and answer more emails that didn't matter. At 6:30 she'd leave, walk to the subway, stand pressed against strangers who smelled like sweat and perfume, and the particular exhaustion that comes from spending your whole life in a city that doesn't care if you exist. She'd get home, microwave something, sit by the window that faced the brick wall, and wonder if this was it, if this narrow, suffocating loop was all there was. She didn't hate her life. That would have required feeling something. She was numb, hollowed out, going through the motions of existing without ever actually living. Her mother called once a week, always on Sundays, always with the same questions. Are you eating enough? Are you seeing anyone? When are you coming home for a visit? Eleanor would lie, say she was fine, say work was busy, say she'd try to make it home for Thanksgiving. She had 3 friends from college she still texted occasionally. They'd make plans to meet up for drinks, and 2 out of 3 times someone would cancel last minute. The one time they did meet, they spent 2 hours talking about jobs they hated and rent they couldn't afford and relationships that were going nowhere. And when Eleanor left, she felt lonelier than when she'd arrived. This was her life. This was what she'd worked for, what she'd gone into debt for, what she woke up every morning and put on business casual clothes for. And she was dying inside. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice, just fading like a photograph left in the sun too long. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late August. She was on the subway, evening rush hour, packed in so tight she could barely breathe. Man's briefcase was digging into her hip. A woman's perfume was so strong it made her eyes water. The train lurched and everyone swayed in unison, a mass of bodies with no individual will. And Eleanor looked around at all these faces, tired, blank, resigned, and realized she couldn't tell where she ended and they began. She was one of them, indistinguishable, replaceable. Body taking up space on a train that would keep running whether she was on it or not. When she got home that night, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child. Not sad tears, angry ones, because somewhere along the way, she traded her life for a paycheck that barely covered rent, and she didn't even remember making the decision. The next morning, she called in sick. She opened her laptop and started searching. She didn't know what she was looking for at first, just somewhere else, anywhere that wasn't a city where millions of people lived on top of each other and still managed to be completely alone. She typed in random words: big sky, open space, fresh start. Montana kept coming up. Articles about people who'd left corporate jobs to work on ranches, photographs of mountains so vast they made you feel small in a way that was freeing instead of crushing, stories about communities where people still knew their neighbors' names. It sounded impossible, like something from a different century, not 2004. But Eleanor was desperate enough to believe in impossible things. She gave her 2 weeks' notice. Her boss barely looked up. Okay, HR will process your final paycheck. That was it. 3 years and she was dismissed in 1 sentence. She sold most of her furniture on Craigslist, packed what was left into 2 suitcases, closed her bank account at the branch on Market Street, where the teller gave her a stack of bills and a look that said, "Good luck, you're going to need it." On September 3, 2004, Eleanor Hayes bought a one-way Greyhound ticket to Bozeman, Montana. She didn't know anyone there, didn't have a job lined up, didn't have a plan beyond get out of Philadelphia before I completely disappear. The bus ride took 3 days. She watched the cities give way to suburbs, the suburbs give way to farmland, The farmland gave way to plains so flat and empty they looked like the edge of the world, and then finally the mountains appeared on the horizon, sharp, real, unforgiving. When she stepped off that bus in Bozeman, the first thing she noticed was the air. It was clean in a way that made her realize how long she'd been breathing poison. It smelled like pine and cold water and something she couldn't name, maybe just the absence of exhaust. Fumes and garbage, and 10 million people living in too small a space. The second thing she noticed was the sky. It was huge, not cut into pieces by skyscrapers, not hidden behind smog, just endless, blue and gold, and so big it made her chest ache. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she could breathe. She spent her first night in a motel that smelled like cheap soap and wood smoke. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the mountains, and wondered if she just made the biggest mistake of her life, or the first real decision she'd ever made. The next morning, she started looking for work. Bozeman wasn't big. It wasn't the kind of place where you could disappear into the crowd. People noticed you, they asked questions. Where you from? What brings you out here? You planning on staying? Eleanor didn't have good answers. I needed a change sounded weak. I was suffocating in Philadelphia sounded dramatic, so she just smiled and said, I'm figuring it out. She found the Cottonwood Cafe on her third day. It was on the outskirts of town, a low building with faded yellow paint and a gravel parking lot. The sign out front said, Help Wanted. Diane, the owner, was in her late 50s with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful and eyes that didn't miss anything. You ever worked food service? Diane asked, not looking up from the register. No, ma'am. You good with early mornings? Yes, ma'am. You one of those city girls who's gonna spend 3 months pretending she loves the country life and then run back home the first time it snows? Eleanor paused. It was a fair question. She didn't know the answer herself. I don't have a home to run back to, she said finally, so I guess I'm here until I'm not. Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she tossed an apron across the counter. Shift start at 5:30, don't be late. The work was hard, harder than anything Eleanor had done in Philadelphia. Not intellectually. There was nothing complicated about pouring coffee or taking orders or wiping down tables, but physically, her feet ached by hour 3, her back screamed by hour 8. She'd go home smelling like grease and bacon and sweat, and she'd fall into bed so tired she couldn't even think. And it was the best she'd felt in years. Because the work mattered in a way her marketing job never had. When she poured coffee for a rancher who'd been up since 4 working cattle, she could see the gratitude in his eyes. When she remembered that Carol liked her toast dry and her eggs over easy, Carol would nod and say, You're paying attention, good. She wasn't just filling space, she was part of something. The regulars started to recognize her. Hank, who ran cattle on the North Ridge and whose dog, a blue heeler named Rusty, would wait outside the diner every morning. Carol, who worked at the feed store and always left a $2 tip even though her meal only cost $6. Old Jean, who'd been coming to the Cottonwood for 40 years and who liked to tell stories about the blizzard of '78 when the snow got so deep they had to dig tunnels between buildings. Eleanor listened. She learned. She started to understand that in a place like this, silence wasn't rude, it was respectful. People didn't talk just to fill the air. They talked when they had something worth saying. She rented a tiny apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, 1 room with a kitchenette, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a window that looked out over the mountains. At night, she'd sit in the dark and watch the stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life. So many they looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. She counted stars instead of subway stops now, but the silence was louder than any city street. Because here's what nobody tells you about running away. You can change the scenery, but you can't change what's inside you. Eleanor had left Philadelphia hoping that Montana would fix her, that the mountains and the clean air and the authentic life would fill the hollow space in her chest. But 2 months in, she realized she just traded one kind of loneliness for another. In the city, she'd been lonely in a crowd. Here, she was lonely in the wide open, and somehow that was worse, because at least in Philadelphia, she could blame the isolation on the city, on the people, on the culture. Here, there was no one to blame but herself. She didn't fit, not yet, maybe not ever. The locals were kind, but they kept a distance. She was an outsider, someone who'd blow through when the fantasy wore off. They'd seen it before, city people who moved out west, looking for some romanticized version of rural life, and then left the second things got hard. Eleanor couldn't blame them for being skeptical. She was skeptical too. By November, her savings were running low. Winter was closing in. The mountains that had looked so beautiful in September now looked like walls closing in around her. The isolation that had felt like freedom at first now felt like solitary confinement with a view. She started to wonder if she'd made a mistake, if she should cut her losses, admit defeat, and buy a ticket back east before the snow made leaving impossible. And that's when Silas Vance's truck broke down outside the diner. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November when everything changed. The lunch rush had cleared out around 2. The diner was empty except for old Gene nursing his third cup of coffee and reading a newspaper so old Eleanor was pretty sure he'd already read it twice. Diane had gone into the back to do inventory. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional clink of Gene's spoon against his mug, and the wind rattling the windows. Eleanor was wiping down the counter for the 4th time. There wasn't much else to do when she heard the cough and sputter of an engine dying. She looked up through the window. A dusty blue Chevy truck was rolling into the parking lot, smoke curling from under the hood in thin gray ribbons. It coasted to a stop near the far edge of the gravel, the engine giving one final shudder before going silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, probably 6'2", broad across the shoulders in the way that came from years of lifting. Fence posts and hay bales not from a gym. He was wearing a sweat-stained Stetson, a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and jeans that had seen better days. Dust covered his boots. His hands were scarred and calloused. He stood there staring at the truck like he was deciding whether to fix it or put it out of its misery. Eleanor watched him through the window. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, like he was considering every action before he took it. He walked around to the front of the truck, popped the hood, and stared down at the engine with the expression of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew exactly how it was going to end. After a minute, he closed the hood, didn't slam it, just pressed it down until it clicked like he was putting something to rest. Then he turned toward the diner. Eleanor looked away quickly, suddenly aware that she'd been staring. She grabbed a coffee pot and made herself look busy. The bell above the door chimed. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, and for just a second their eyes met. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not dramatic, not like the movies, just a small, quiet recognition, like her body knew something her brain hadn't figured out yet. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at her with eyes the color of weathered denim and waited. "Afternoon," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "Truck give you trouble?" "Radiator," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges like it didn't get used much. "3rd time this month." You gonna fix it or shoot it? The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Eleanor felt something. Warm flicker in her stomach. Haven't decided yet, he said. He crossed to the counter and sat down on one of the red vinyl stools. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, not from age but from squinting into the sun for years. There was a smudge of grease on his jaw. His hands rested on the counter, palms down, and she noticed the scars, white lines across his knuckles, a thick one running along his thumb, the kind of scars you got from working with barbed wire and cattle and machinery that didn't forgive mistakes. Coffee? Eleanor asked. Please. She poured. Her hands were steady, but her heart was doing something strange and unfamiliar. Behind her ribs, she slid the mug across the counter. He wrapped both hands around it like he needed the warmth, even though it was barely cold outside. He didn't drink right away, just held it, stared into it like the coffee might have answers. Eleanor waited. She'd learned that much about Montana. You didn't rush people into conversation. You gave them space, and if they wanted to talk, they would. After a long moment, he looked up. You're new, he said, not a question, a statement. Been here 2 months. Where from? Philadelphia. He nodded slowly, like that explained something. Long way to come for diner work. Long way to come for anything, Eleanor said. He looked at her then, really looked, not the way men in the city looked at her, quick. Assessing, forgetting her before they'd even finished looking. This was different. He was looking at her the way you'd look at something you were trying to understand, like he was reading a map and trying to figure out where she belonged. You running from something or running to something? He asked. The question caught her off guard. It was too direct, too honest, the kind of question you didn't ask a stranger in a diner on a Tuesday afternoon. But somehow it didn't feel invasive. It felt like he genuinely wanted to know. Both, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Neither, I don't know yet. He nodded again, took a sip of his coffee, didn't push for more. They sat in silence for a minute. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. What about you? Eleanor asked finally. You from around here? Born here, grew up on a ranch about 15 miles north of town, still there. Family ranch. My grandfather started it, passed it to my father, now it's mine. He said it without pride or complaint, just fact. That must be nice, Eleanor said, having roots like that, knowing where you belong. Something flickered across his face, not quite pain but close. Roots can feel like chains sometimes, he said quietly, especially when the thing you're tied to is sinking. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, just refilled his coffee even, though he'd barely touched the first cup. He stayed for 20 minutes, didn't order food, just sat there drinking coffee and occasionally saying something that felt more substantial than most conversations she'd had in months. When he finally stood to leave, he pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and laid a $5 bill on the counter. Coffee's $2.50, Eleanor said. I know. He put his hat back on, adjusted it low over his eyes, and headed for the door. Hey, Eleanor called out before she could stop herself. What's your name? He paused with his hand on the door, turned back. Silas Vance. I'm Eleanor. I know, he said, and then he was gone. Eleanor stood there holding the $5 bill, her heart doing that strange flutter thing again, and wondered what the hell had just happened. Diane came out from the back, took one look at Eleanor's face and smiled. That's Silas Vance, she said, like that explained everything. He always tipped that much for coffee. He doesn't usually come in at all, keeps to himself mostly, works that ranch from sunup to sundown 7 days a week. Diane paused. Good man, quiet, honest, the kind of man who says what he means and means what he says. His truck broke down, Eleanor said, still staring at the door like he might walk back through it. His truck breaks down a lot, Diane said. Usually he fixes it on the side of the road and keeps going. Interesting that he decided to stop here today. Eleanor looked at her. What are you saying? Diane just smiled and went back to inventory. Over the next 3 weeks, Silas came into the diner 6 more times. Never for a meal, always just coffee. He'd sit at the counter, drink it slow, leave a $5 bill, and go. Sometimes he'd talk, most times he wouldn't, but even the silence felt like communication. Eleanor learned things about him in fragments, small pieces he'd offer up like gifts. He was 31, never married. His father had died 4 years ago, leaving him the ranch and a mountain of debt. His mother, Martha, still lived in the main house. He had 2 hired hands who helped during calving season, but most of the time it was just him. Sounds lonely, Eleanor had said once. It is, Silas had replied. No shame in admitting it, just honesty. She told him about Philadelphia, about the apartment that faced a brick wall, about feeling invisible in a city of millions, about waking up one day and realizing she'd rather risk failing in the middle of nowhere than succeed at a life that was slowly killing her. He'd listened, really listened, the way he did everything carefully, deliberately, like her words mattered. You're not from here, he'd said when she finished, but you're not from there anymore either. You're misplaced, stuck between who you were and who you're trying to be. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about her. Is that a bad thing? She'd asked. No, he'd said, just means you haven't found where you fit yet, doesn't mean it's not out here somewhere. The 4th time he came in, he showed up with grease on his hands and exhaustion written into every line of his face. Rough day? Eleanor asked, pouring his coffee without him having to ask. Lost a calf this morning, born too early, too weak, couldn't save it. I'm sorry. He nodded, stared into his coffee. Part of the job doesn't make it easier. They sat in silence. Eleanor wanted to say something comforting, something that would take the weight off his shoulders, but she didn't know how, so she just stayed there, present, and somehow that seemed to be enough. When he left that day, he'd paused at the door and said, "Thanks, Eleanor." For what? I didn't do anything. You were here, he said, and then he was gone. The 6th time he came in, he asked her a question that made her heart stop. You ever been out to a working ranch? No. You want to? Eleanor's breath caught. This was it. This was the moment where almost turned into something real. When? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sunday after church. I could pick you up around noon, show you the place, have you back before dark. It wasn't a date, not technically, but it felt like one. It felt like he was offering her a glimpse into his world, into the life he'd been carrying alone for so long. Eleanor opened her mouth to say yes, and froze. Because saying yes meant something. It meant she was staying. It meant she was letting herself hope that Montana could be more than just a place she was hiding. It meant risking the possibility that she might care about this quiet, careful man who looked at her like she mattered. And that caring might end the way caring always ended, with her alone and disappointed and wishing she'd kept her walls up. Maybe, she heard herself say, let me check my schedule. The light in Silas's eyes dimmed just slightly. He nodded, sure, no pressure. He left his $5, walked out, and Eleanor stood there hatting herself for being too scared to say yes. He didn't come back for 2 weeks. When he finally did, it was late afternoon. The diner was almost empty. He sat at the counter, and Eleanor poured his coffee with hands that shook just slightly. I'm sorry, she said before he could say anything. About before, I wanted to say yes, I just... You don't owe me an explanation, Eleanor. I know, but I want to give you one anyway. She took a breath. I'm scared I came here thinking Montana would fix me, and it hasn't. And I'm terrified that if I let myself believe this, she gestured between them, could be real, I'll just end up disappointed, again. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she'd never forget. I can't promise you won't be disappointed. Life doesn't work that way, especially not out here. But I can promise you this, I won't lie to you. I won't pretend to be something I'm not, and I won't ask you for anything you're not ready to give. He stood, put his hat on, left his $5. Offer's still open, he said, when you're ready, if you're ever ready. And then he walked out, leaving Eleanor standing there with tears in her eyes and the crushing realization that she was falling for a man who deserved better than her fear the almosts were. What killed her? Not the rejections, not the failures, the almosts, the moments that came so close to becoming something real that she could taste them, and then dissolved like smoke the second she reached for them. 3 days after Silas walked out of the diner with his offer still hanging in the air, Eleanor made her decision. She was going to say yes. She'd spent those 3 days arguing with herself, listing all the reasons it was a bad idea, all the ways it could go wrong, all the evidence from her past that proved she wasn't the kind of person who got happy endings. But on Friday morning, she woke up and realized something that cut through all the fear. She'd rather regret trying than spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. So when Silas walked into the diner that afternoon, earlier than usual, hat in hand, shoulders tight like he was bracing for another rejection, Eleanor didn't give him time to sit down. Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes. To the ranch, I want to see it. Sunday at noon, I'll be ready. For the first time since she'd met him, Silas Vance smiled, really smiled. It transformed his whole face, softened the hard edges that came from years of carrying too much weight alone. He looked younger, lighter. Okay, he said. Okay, I'll pick you up outside the hardware store. I'll be there. He ordered coffee, drank it slower than usual. They talked about nothing important, the weather, the upcoming winter, whether old Gene's stories about the blizzard of '78 were exaggerated or not, but underneath the small talk was something electric, anticipation, possibility. When he left, he paused at the door. I'm glad you said yes, Eleanor. Me too. She spent Saturday cleaning her apartment even though it was already clean, trying on different combinations of clothes, even though she only owned about 6 outfits total, and none of them were appropriate for a ranch, telling herself to calm down because it wasn't a date, it was just a tour, just 2 people who become something like friends spending an afternoon together. By Sunday morning, she was a wreck. She woke up at dawn even though he wasn't picking her up until noon, made coffee, couldn't drink it, stared at the mountains, and wondered what the hell she was doing. At 11:30, she was standing outside the hardware store, wearing jeans and the warmest jacket she owned, her hair pulled back in a ponytail because she didn't know what else to do with it. By 11:45, she was packing. By 11:50, she was starting to think he'd changed his mind. And then she heard it, the rumble of an engine, not the dying cough of his usual truck, but something deeper, steadier. A dark green Ford F-250 pulled up to the curb. Silas was behind the wheel. He'd cleaned up, fresh shirt, clean jeans, hair still damp like he'd just showered. He got out, came around to her side. You fixed the truck, she said. Borrowed my neighbor's. Didn't want to risk breaking down halfway there. He opened the passenger door for her. She climbed in. The cab smelled like leather and coffee, and something woodsy she couldn't name. They drove north out of Bozeman, the town falling away behind them, replaced by open range and distant mountains. The road was paved for the first 10 miles, then turned to gravel. Silas drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, relaxed in a way she'd never seen him in the diner. "How long have you been running the ranch alone?" Eleanor asked. 4 years, since my father passed." "That's a lot of responsibility for one person." "It is," he glanced at her, "but it's what he would have wanted, what my grandfather would have wanted. Can't let 100 years of family history die because it's hard, even if it's drowning you." He was quiet for a moment, even then. They turned off the main gravel road onto a narrower track that wound up into the foothills. Through the windshield, Eleanor could see fence lines stretching into the distance, cattle grazing in clusters, the land rolling and vast and impossibly beautiful. "This is it," Silas said. "Vance Ranch, 3,000 acres, used to be 5,000 before. We had to sell off the eastern section to pay down debt." He said it matter-of-factly, but Eleanor could hear the pain underneath. They pulled up to a 2-story timber house with a wraparound porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Nearby were a barn, a few outbuildings, and a small cottage tucked under a massive cottonwood tree. "That's the main house," Silas said, pointing. "My mother lives there, and that," he nodded toward the cottage, "used to be the foreman's place back when we had money for a foreman." Eleanor was about to respond when the front door of the main house opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 50s, silver hair pulled back in a braid, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. She had Silas's eyes, the same careful, measuring gaze that didn't miss anything. "That's Martha," Silas said. "My mother. She's been asking when I was going to stop being stubborn and bring you out here. She knows about me." "Everyone knows about you, Eleanor. Small town, and I'm not exactly subtle." Before Eleanor could process that, Martha was walking toward the truck, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Silas got out. Eleanor followed. "Ma, this is Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor, this is my mother, Martha Vance." Martha looked Eleanor up and down, not unkindly, just thoroughly. Then she smiled. "So you're the one who's got my son coming into town 4 times a week for coffee he could make it home." Eleanor felt her face heat. Don't be embarrassed. It's about time he remembered there's more to life than cattle and debt." Martha turned to Silas. "You showing her around, or are you just going to stand there?" "I'm showing her around." "Good, I'm making stew for dinner. You're both staying." It wasn't a question. Silas gave Eleanor a look that said, "I'm sorry, she's like this," and Eleanor gave him one back that said, "It's okay, I like her already." They spent the next 2 hours walking the property. Silas showed her the barn where the horses were kept, introduced her to the charcoal gelding he'd been riding the day his truck broke down, took her up to the high pasture where you could see the entire valley spread out below, the mountains framing it on all sides. "This is why I can't leave," Silas said, standing at the fence line looking out over land that had been in his family for generations. "Even when it's killing me, even when I can't make the numbers work, this is home, it's in my blood." Eleanor stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and felt something shift inside her, not fear, not doubt, just clarity. She could see it, a life here, roots that went deep instead of wide, mornings that started with mountains instead of brick walls, a man who spoke carefully because words mattered to him. She could see it so clearly it hurt. They walked back to the house as the sun started to sink toward the horizon. Martha fed them stew that tasted like it had been simmering all day, with fresh bread and butter and conversation that felt easy and warm. When it was time to leave, Silas drove her back to town. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, full. He pulled up outside the hardware store just as the streetlights were coming on. Thank you, Eleanor said, for today, for showing me your world. Thank you for coming. She reached for the door handle, hesitated, turned back. Sela's eye. And that's when her phone rang. She'd forgotten she even had it with her. The sound was jarring, intrusive, pulling her out of the moment and back into the reality she'd been trying to escape. She looked at the screen, her mother. I'm sorry, I have to. Go ahead. She answered. Her mother's voice was frantic. Her aunt had fallen, broken her hip, was in the hospital. They needed Eleanor to come home. Not forever, just for a few weeks, just until they could figure out care arrangements. Eleanor felt the moment dissolve. The thing she'd been about to say to Sela's, whatever it was, evaporated. I have to go back east, she said when she hung up. Family emergency, I don't know for how long. Sela's nodded. His face was unreadable. You need a ride to the airport. No, I'll figure it out. She looked at him, this man who'd spent the whole day showing her a life she desperately wanted and was terrified to reach for. I'm sorry. Don't be, family comes first. She got out of the truck, started walking toward the stairs that led to her apartment, heard him call her name. Eleanor. She turned. Come back, he said. When you're done with what you need to do, come back. She wanted to promise she would, wanted to say that nothing could keep her away, but the words stuck in her throat because promises felt dangerous, and she'd broken too many of them already. So she just nodded and went inside and spent the next 3 weeks in Philadelphia taking care of her aunt and wondering if she'd just ruined the best thing that had almost happened to her. When she got back to Montana, Sela's didn't come into the diner for 5 days. December hit Bozeman like a fist. The temperatures dropped. Snow fell in heavy, wet curtains that turned the world white and quiet. The diner's business slowed to a trickle, mostly locals who came in for coffee and warmth and to complain about how early winter had arrived this year. Eleanor worked her shifts and went home and stared out at the mountains and tried not to think about the fact that Sela's hadn't come by since she'd returned from Philadelphia. She told herself it was the weather. The ranch work was probably brutal right now. He didn't have time for coffee runs. She told herself it wasn't personal, that she hadn't ruined anything. She told herself a lot of things that didn't make the ache in her chest go away. On the 6th day, he walked in. It was late afternoon. The light outside was already fading, the kind of early darkness that came with winter. He was covered in snow, his coat crusted with ice, his face red from wind. He sat at the counter without a word. Eleanor poured his coffee. Their eyes met. Neither of them looked away. How's your aunt? He asked finally. Better, she's in a rehab facility now, learning to walk again. That's good. Yeah. Silence, heavy and awkward in a way it had never been between them before. Sela's eye. Eleanor, I need to. They both stopped, both tried to smile, failed. You first, Eleanor said. He took a breath, set his coffee down, looked at her with an intensity that made her heart hammer. I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for 2 weeks, practicing it, trying to get it right, because I'm not good at this. I'm better with cattle than people, better with work than words. Sela's. Just let me say it, please, before I lose my nerve. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. That day at the ranch, he continued, his voice low and rough, when you were standing there, looking out at the valley, I realized something. I realized that I've been working this land for 4 years trying to keep it alive for my father, for my grandfather, for the legacy, and I've been so focused on not failing them that I forgot what it feels like to actually want something for myself. He paused, his hands were shaking slightly. And then you showed up, and for the first time since my father died, I wanted something that Wasn't about duty or responsibility or keeping promises to dead men. I wanted. The bell above the door chimed. Carol walked in, stamping snow off her boots, complaining loudly about the roads being a mess, and how she almost slid into a ditch on her way over. "Eleanor, honey, can I get some coffee to go? I've got to get back before the highway gets worse." Eleanor wanted to scream, wanted to tell Carol to wait, to give them 5 more minutes to let Silas finish the sentence that might change everything. But she couldn't, so she smiled and said, "Of course," and poured the coffee while Silas sat there, the moment dying in real time. Carol paid, left, the bell chimed again. Eleanor turned back to Silas. "What were you going to say?" But whatever courage he'd been holding onto was gone. She could see it in his eyes. The moment had passed, the window had closed. "Nothing," he said quietly. "It doesn't matter." "Silas, please. I should get back, storm's getting worse." He stood, put money on the counter, more than $5 this time, like he was trying to pay for something that didn't have a price. "Don't go, not like this." He looked at her, and for just a second she saw everything he wasn't saying written in the lines of his face, the loneliness, the hope, the fear that he'd already lost her before he ever really had her. "Take care, Eleanor." And then he was gone, out into the snow, into the truck that roared to life and disappeared into the white. Eleanor stood there holding the money he'd left, tears burning her eyes, and hated herself for not chasing after him. January was brutal. The coldest winter Bozeman had seen in a decade, according to old Jean, who would know. The diner's heat barely worked. Eleanor's apartment was freezing despite the space heater she'd bought at the hardware store. The world outside was white and gray and endless. Silas came in twice that month. Both times he was polite, distant. He'd order coffee, drink it quickly, leave exact change and go. No extra tip, no lingering, no looking at her like she mattered. Eleanor felt herself disappearing again. Not the same way she had in Philadelphia. This was different, sharper, because in Philadelphia she'd been numb. Here she felt everything, every cold morning, every empty afternoon, every moment Silas Vance treated her like a stranger. Her savings were almost gone. Diane had told her the diner couldn't guarantee hours through. The winter business was too slow. Eleanor had started looking at bus schedules, started calculating how much a ticket back east would cost, started accepting that Montana had been a beautiful dream she'd woken up from too soon. On the last Friday in January, Silas came in just before closing. The diner was empty. Diane had already left. It was just Eleanor wiping down tables that didn't need wiping, killing time before she could lock up and go home to her freezing apartment. The bell chimed. She looked up. Silas stood in the doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, his face exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical work. "We're about to close," Eleanor said, and immediately hated how cold she sounded. "I know, He took off his hat, ran his hand through his hair. "Can I talk to you, just for a minute?" She nodded. He sat at the counter. She didn't pour coffee, just stood there, arms crossed, protecting herself from whatever was coming. "I've been an ass," Silas said. "These last few weeks, I know that, and I'm sorry." "You don't owe me an apology." "I do, though, because you didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who," he stopped, tried. "Again, I got scared. When you left for Philadelphia, I convinced myself you weren't coming back, that I'd read the whole thing wrong, that you were just being nice to some lonely rancher who didn't know when to quit." "Silas. And when you did come back, I didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know if it meant what I wanted it to mean or if I was just setting myself up to get hurt. So I pulled back, kept my distance, told myself it was easier that way." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. But it's not easier, it's just lonely. And I'm tired of being lonely, Eleanor. I'm tired of pretending I don't look for your truck when I drive into town. I'm tired of lying to myself about why I keep coming here when I could make coffee at home. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you, but I want to try, if you'll let me. The words hung in the air between them. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment where she could choose to be brave or choose to be safe. Come with me, Eleanor said suddenly. What? Right now, come with me. I want to show you something. She grabbed her coat, locked up the diner, led him outside to where his truck was parked. They drove in silence through the snow-covered streets to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. She made him stop. They got out. The sun was setting over the mountains, the sky turning shades of orange and pink and purple that looked like they'd been painted by someone who'd never learned the word subtle. The snow caught the light, turning the whole world gold. This is what I see every night, Eleanor said, her breath fogging in the cold air. This is why I can't leave, not because of the diner or the apartment or anything practical, because of this. Because Montana showed me that the world can be beautiful and vast and terrifying all at once. And I don't want to go back to a place where I can't see the sky. She turned to face him. And because of you, because you looked at me like I wasn't invisible, like I mattered, and I don't know how to do this either, Silas. I don't know how to let myself care about someone without being terrified they're going to leave or realize I'm not worth the trouble. But I'm tired too. Tired of running, tired of almost. Silas was staring at her like she just answered a question he'd been asking his whole life. He took a step toward her. She took a step toward him. They were inches apart now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the cold. Eleanor, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Yeah. His phone rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass. He closed his eyes, swore softly, pulled it from his pocket. It's the ranch, he said, looking at the screen. I have to. I know, answer it. He did, his face went tight as he listened. When? How bad? Okay, I'm on my way. He hung up, looked at her with frustration and regret warring in his expression. One of the calving barns is flooding. Pipes burst. I have to go deal with it before we lose half the herd. Go, it's fine. It's not fine. He looked at her at the sunset, at the moment that was slipping away. I don't want to leave like this. Then don't come back when you're done. Come find me. He nodded, started to turn, stopped. I will, I promise. She watched him drive away, tail lights disappearing into the dusk, and tried to believe him. But he didn't come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. And a week later, Eleanor bought the train ticket. Because almost, she realized, were worse than goodbyes. They were the spaces where hope lived and died at the same time. They were the moments that taught you that wanting something wasn't enough, that being brave wasn't enough. Sometimes people didn't come back. Sometimes the sunset was just a sunset, and the story ended before it ever really began. Stop. For a second. Just stop and think about the last person who mattered to you, the one you let walk away. Because the timing wasn't right, the one you convinced yourself you'd circle back to when things settled down, when you felt more ready, when the moment was more perfect. Are they still there, or did they get tired of waiting? We've all had someone like Silas in our lives, someone who showed up consistently, who looked at us like we were worth the trouble, who offered us a chance at something real. And we've all had our reasons for hesitating, valid reasons, Good reasons even. Too scared, too broken, too busy, too uncertain about whether we deserved it. But here's the thing about good people who care about you: they don't wait forever. They can't. Because loving someone who won't let themselves be loved is exhausting, and eventually, even the most patient person runs out of patience. Eleanor had 3 chances, 3 moments where she could have chosen Sela's chosen. Montana chosen a life that was hard but real, and every single time something got in the way. A phone call, an interruption, fear dressed up as responsibility. And Sela's, he kept showing up, kept trying, kept leaving that door open even when it would have been easier to close it. Until he couldn't anymore. That's what the almosts do to you. They don't just break your heart once, they break it slowly in pieces until you're standing at a train platform with a one-way ticket and no idea how you got there. If you've ever felt that regret, that sick, hollow feeling of watching someone disappear from your life because you were too scared to fight for them, then you're in the right place. Because this story isn't just about Eleanor and Sela's. It's about every single one of us who's ever chosen comfort over courage, safety over risk, the known disappointment over the unknown possibility. And if you're sitting there thinking, I would never let someone like Sela's go, I need you to be honest with yourself, because you probably already have. Maybe not a cowboy, maybe not Montana, but someone, somewhere, a moment you let slip through your fingers because you weren't ready to hold on to it. Subscribe so you never miss a story that might change how you see your own life. Not because these stories have happy endings, some do, some don't, but because they hold up a mirror and force you to look at the choices you're making right now, in real time, before it's too late to change them. These aren't just cowboy stories. They're not just romance. They're lessons wrapped in leather and dust and heartbreak. They're reminders that life doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It just keeps moving, and the people who matter, they move with it. So if you've been watching these stories and feeling something shift inside you, if they're making you think about your own almosts, your own missed chances, your own train platforms, then hit subscribe. Join this community of people who are done playing it safe, who are tired of letting fear write the ending. Because here's what I know: the people who subscribe aren't just passive viewers, they're people who recognize themselves in these stories, people who are brave enough to admit they've made mistakes, people who want to do better next time. And there's always a next time, until there isn't. Eleanor's standing on that platform right now. Sela's is racing toward her on horseback, and you already know how hard it is to make that choice when everything in you is screaming to play it safe. So subscribe. Be part of a community that believes in second chances, in courage over comfort, in showing up even when it's terrifying. Because the next story we tell, it might be the one that keeps you from boarding your own train. That ache you're feeling right now, that tightness in your chest when you think about Eleanor watching Sela's ride away into the dusk, promising to come back and then not coming back. That's not just for Eleanor. That's for you. That's for every time you stayed silent when you should have spoken, every time you watched someone walk away because the timing wasn't right, every time you convinced yourself that if it was meant to be, it would be easy. Let me tell you something nobody wants to hear. Timing is a lie we tell ourselves when we're too scared to fight for what we want. Eleanor had 3 perfect moments, 3 chances to say the words that would have changed everything, and every single time she found a reason not to. A phone call, an interruption, burst pipe at a ranch 15 miles away. But those weren't the real reasons, were they? The real reason was fear. Fear that if she reached for something good, it would be taken away. Fear that she wasn't enough. Fear that choosing Sela's meant choosing a life she didn't know how to live. And I'm willing to bet you've been there too. Maybe it wasn't a cowboy. Maybe it was a job opportunity you passed on because it felt too risky, a relationship you sabotaged because you didn't believe you deserved it, a dream you buried because chasing it meant you might fail. We all do it. We all let fear dress itself up as wisdom and tell us that walking away is the mature choice, the responsible choice, the safe choice. But here's what nobody tells you about safe choices. They don't keep you safe. They just keep you small. You know what's worse than taking a risk and failing? Never taking the risk at all. Because failure you can recover from. You can learn from it. You can try again. But regret. Regret is the thing that sits in your chest at 3 in the morning when you're 45 years old and still wondering what would have happened if you'd just been brave enough to say yes. Eleanor is about to board a train that will take her back to a life she already knows doesn't fit her. Back to the brick wall apartment, back to the subway crowds where everyone is invisible, back to existing instead of living. And Silas, he's racing across Montana on horseback, pushing his horse harder than he should, risking everything for one last chance to tell her the truth he should have told her months ago. One of them is running away. One of them is running toward. Which one are you? Subscribe, because in 3 days you won't remember this story. The details will fade. The names will blur, but you'll remember the feeling. You'll remember that ache. And you'll remember the moment you had a choice between staying engaged with stories that challenge you or scrolling past to something easier. And here's the brutal truth. If you can't commit to clicking a button that costs you nothing, how are you ever going to commit to the things that actually cost something? How are you going to fight for the relationship that requires vulnerability, the career chain that requires risk, the life that requires you to stop playing it safe? This is practice. This is the low-stakes version of the choice you're going to face in your real life. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe it's already sitting in front of you right now and you've been avoiding it. Subscribe, not for me, not for Eleanor and Silas, for you, for the version of yourself who's tired of being too late, too scared, too careful. For the version of yourself who wants to be brave enough to stay on the platform when everyone else is boarding the train. And if you still won't click that button, if subscription still feels like too much even after everything you've just heard, then I need you to do something else. I need you to drop a comment below and tell me why. What are you waiting for? What perfect moment are you holding out for that's never going to come? What's so scary about committing to stories that might actually change how you see your own life? Because here's what I think. You're scared that if you subscribe, if you keep watching these stories, you're going to have to face the truth about your own choices. You're going to have to admit that you've been playing it safe, that you've let people go, that you've boarded trains you should have walked away from. And that's uncomfortable. It's easier to scroll past, to watch without committing, to stay on the edges where nothing can touch you. But the edges are lonely, and they don't lead anywhere except more edges. So comment, tell me what's holding you back. Tell me what train you're about to board. Tell me what choice you're avoiding right now because you're waiting for permission or certainty or some sign from the universe that it's the right move. I'll tell you the sign. There isn't one. There's never a sign. There's just you and the choice and the clock ticking down. Eleanor's got about 30 seconds before that conductor closes the door. Silas is still 200 yards away. And you're sitting here deciding whether to care about how it ends. So decide, right now. Subscribe or comment, but don't just watch and walk away like this didn't mean anything. Because if this story doesn't mean anything to you, then you're exactly the person who needs it most. You're the one who's forgot what it feels like to want something badly enough to risk losing it. You're the one who's been numb for so long that even other people's pain doesn't register anymore. And that's the saddest thing of all. Not that Eleanor might get on that train, but that you might. Watch her do it and feel nothing. So prove me wrong, subscribe, comment, show me you're still capable of caring about something that isn't safe or guaranteed or packaged in a way that requires nothing from you. Show me you're still capable of being moved. Because in 3 days this story will be over, but your life, your choices, those are still being written. And the question is, are you going to be the person who boards the train or the person who jumps? While Eleanor was packing her bags and buying train tickets, Silas Vance was standing in a barn at 4 in the morning, trying to keep 100 years of family history from collapsing. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. Silas kept the ranch's financial records in a battered leather ledger his grandfather had started in 1934. 70 years of entries written in 3 different hands, his grandfather's careful script, his father's rushed scrawl, and now his own tight, controlled printing. The pages told a story of survival, the depression, the droughts, the years when beef prices dropped so low they were practically giving cattle away, the blizzards that killed entire herds, the slow, grinding decline of small family ranches in the face of corporate agriculture. His grandfather had held on through sheer stubbornness, his father through sacrifice, and now it was Silas's turn, and he was losing. The debt sat at $247,000, medical bills from his father's cancer treatment that insurance hadn't covered, equipment loans for machinery that broke down faster than they could pay it off, operating expenses that climbed every year while cattle prices stayed flat. They'd already sold the eastern section, 2,000 acres that had been in the family since the beginning. The money had bought them 2 more years, maybe 3 if the winters were mild and nothing catastrophic happened. But catastrophic things always happened: broken fences, sick cattle, machinery that gave out at the worst possible time, and now flooding in the calving barn because pipes that should have been replaced 5 years ago finally quit. Silas had spent 3 nights straight dealing with that flood, moving newborn calves to temporary shelter, ripping out ruined insulation, trying to patch a system that was fundamentally broken with duct tape and prayers. He'd meant to go back to the diner, meant to find Eleanor after that sunset conversation and finish what he'd started to say, meant to tell her that when she stood there in the gold light, talking about Montana and beauty and not wanting to be invisible anymore, he'd realized something. He'd realized he was in love with her. Not the careful, measured kind of love that made sense, the reckless kind, the kind that made a man want to tear down all his walls and hand someone the keys to every broken part of him and hope they'd stay anyway. But he hadn't gone back, because the barn was flooding and the calves were dying, and his mother was asking him questions he didn't have answers to, like, how much longer can we keep doing this, and what happens when the money runs out? And Silas didn't know. He'd been running on fumes and willpower for 4 years, and he was so tired he couldn't see straight. His father used to say that ranching wasn't a job, it was a calling, that if you had the land in your blood, you didn't have a choice. You did the work because the work needed doing. You sacrificed because that's what you did for the things you loved. But his father had also died at 56, worn down to nothing, leaving Silas with a legacy of debt. And a lesson he was still trying to understand: sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes sacrifice just means losing slowly instead of all at once. Silas had never wanted anything for himself, not really. Everything he did was for the ranch, for his mother, for the memory of the men who'd built this place with their hands and expected him to keep it standing. And then Eleanor walked into his life and made him want something that had nothing to do with duty. He wanted her laugh, wanted her looking at him like he was more than just the sum of his responsibilities, wanted to wake up next to someone who'd chosen to be there, not because they were tied to the land by blood and obligation, but because they wanted him. But what did he have to offer her? A ranch that was drowning in debt, a house that needed repairs he couldn't afford, winters that were brutal and summers that were short, a life of early mornings and late nights and constant worry about whether there'd be enough money to make it through another year. She deserved better than that, deserved someone who could take her to dinner without checking his bank account first, someone who didn't smell like cattle and sweat at the end of every day, someone who had a future that didn't involve selling off pieces of his soul to pay down debt. But he'd asked her anyway. That day at the ranch, he'd been ready to ask her to give him a chance despite all of it, to see if maybe she could love this life the way he did, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And she'd almost said yes. He'd seen it in her eyes, the wanting, the fear, the war between the person she'd been and the person she was trying to become. Then her mother called, and she went back to Philadelphia, and when she came back 3 weeks later, something had changed. She was pulling away, protecting herself, and Silas understood that because he was doing the same thing. Because loving someone when you didn't know if you could keep the lights on, when you didn't know if the bank was going to call the loan and take everything you'd fought for, that wasn't fair, not to her, not to either of them. So he'd pulled back too, told himself it was for the best, that she needed someone stable, and he was anything but, that she'd figure out Montana wasn't for her and leave anyway, and it would hurt less if he hadn't let himself hope. But it didn't hurt less. It hurt every single day. Every time he drove past the diner and didn't stop, every time he saw her light on in the apartment window and kept going, every time he lay awake at night remembering the way she'd looked standing on his land, talking about stars and sky and belonging. His mother knew, of course she knew, Martha Vance didn't miss anything. "You're being stupid," she told him one night over dinner. "That girl looks at you like you hung the moon, and you're too proud to admit you feel the same way." "It's not about pride, Ma." "Then what's it about?" "I can't ask her to tie herself to a sinking ship." Martha had set down her fork and looked at him with the same expression she'd used when he was 16 and being particularly dense. "This ranch has been sinking for 70 years, Silas. We've always been one bad year away from losing it. That's not new. What's new is you using it as an excuse to keep people at arm's length." "I'm not." "You are. You've been doing it since your father died. You think if you just work hard enough, sacrifice enough, suffer enough, you'll earn the right to want something for yourself. But that's not how it works. You don't earn happiness. You choose it or you don't. And what happens when I choose it and lose it?" His mother had reached across the table and taken his hand. "Then you lose it, and it hurts, and you survive, just like we survived losing your father, just like we survived selling the East section, just like we'll survive whatever comes next. But what if I can't give her what she deserves? What she deserves is someone who sees her, who chooses her, who's brave enough to show up even when it's hard. You think money's what matters, a stable job, a guarantee. That girl ran from all of that to come here. She's not looking for safe, Silas. She's looking for real." He'd wanted to believe her, wanted to march into town that night and tell Eleanor everything he'd been holding back, but the fear was too big, the weight of responsibility too heavy. What if he failed? What if the ranch went under and he dragged her down with it? What if she said yes, and then realized a year from now that she'd made a mistake, and he had to watch her Leave knowing he'd let her hope for something he couldn't deliver. So he'd done nothing again. And the distance between them grew wider. Until that Friday in late January when he couldn't take it anymore, when he'd walked into the diner just before closing because he had to at least try, had to tell her the truth even if it changed nothing. And she'd taken him to see the sunset, and she'd said she was tired of almost, and he'd been about to tell her he loved her when the phone rang, and the barn flooded and he had to leave. He'd promised to come back, meant it with everything he had. But by the time he got the flooding under control, 3 days had passed, and when he finally drove into town, ready to find her and finish the conversation, Diane told him she bought a train ticket, leaving Friday back east. The words hit him like a physical blow. Did she say why? Diane had given him a look that said you know why. Her savings are gone, Silas. Winter killed what little business we had. I couldn't give her enough hours. She doesn't have family here, doesn't have a reason to stay. She has me. Does she? Because from where I'm standing, you've been treating her like a stranger for 2 months. Can't blame the girl for thinking she's not wanted. Silas had walked out of that diner feeling like he'd been gutted. She was leaving in 2 days, and it was his fault. He'd been so busy protecting himself from the possibility of loss that he'd guaranteed it. He drove home, sat in his truck outside the barn, stared at the mountains and tried to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do. His whole life he'd done the responsible thing, the dutiful thing. He'd sacrificed his own wants. For the ranch, for his mother, for a legacy that might not even survive another 5 years. And where had it gotten him? Alone, exhausted, watching the woman he loved prepare to leave. Because he'd been too scared to fight for her. His father used to say that the land demanded everything, that if you loved it, you gave it your whole life and didn't ask for anything back. But sitting there in the cold truck, Silas realized something his father had never taught him. The land couldn't love you back. It couldn't hold you when you were broken, couldn't tell you that you mattered, couldn't choose you the way a person could. And maybe some things were worth more than legacy, more than duty, more than keeping promises to dead men. Maybe some things were worth risking everything for. Silas sat there until the sun went down, until the stars came out, until he'd made his decision. Friday morning he got up at dawn, fed the cattle, fixed the fence that had been on his to-do list for a week, told his mother he'd be gone for a few hours. She'd looked at him, saw something in his face and smiled. About time was all she said. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he was going to say, just knew he couldn't let her get on that train without telling her the truth. That he loved her, that he was terrified, that he didn't have much to offer except hard work in an uncertain future, but that if she'd give him a chance, just one real chance, he'd spend the rest of his life trying to be worth it. He checked the train schedule. Departure was at noon. He'd ride into town, find her, say the words before it was too late. But at 11:30, one of the horses got caught in wire fencing, cut its leg bad enough that Silas had to stop and deal with it before the animal bled out. By the time he got the horse stable and bandaged, it was 11:50. The train left in 10 minutes. The ranch was 15 miles from the depot. There was no way he'd make it, not in the truck, not on the roads. But on horseback, cutting across the ridge through the pastures straight down into town. It would be reckless, dangerous. He'd be pushing the gelding past any reasonable limit. But Silas Vance was done being reasonable. He grabbed the reins, swung into the saddle, and rode. And then the day came when she bought the ticket. It was a Wednesday, February 3rd, 2004, the kind of gray, bitter morning where the cold didn't just bite, it chewed. Eleanor walked into the Greyhound station on the north edge of Bozeman with her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets and her mind already made up, or so she told herself. The station was barely a station, just a small office attached to a gas station with a single window where a woman in her 40s sat reading a romance novel and looking bored. "Help you?" the woman asked without looking up. "One-way ticket to Philadelphia, Friday departure." Now the woman looked up. "You sure? Weather forecast says we might get hit with a storm this weekend, could delay things." "I'm sure." The woman shrugged, typed something into an ancient computer. "That'll be $218. Eleanor pulled out her debit card. Her hand was shaking slightly. She told herself it was the cold. The machine beeped. The receipt printed. The woman slid the ticket across the counter in a paper sleeve. "Bus leaves at noon on Friday. Be here 30 minutes early. Don't be late, we won't hold it." Eleanor took the ticket, stared at it. The paper was thin, cheap, already starting to curl at the edges from the heat coming off the register. This was it. This was her exit, her escape route from a life that had almost worked out. She should have felt relief. She should have felt like she was taking control, making the smart decision, choosing survival over stupid hope. Instead, she felt like she was suffocating. "You okay, honey?" the woman asked, actually sounding concerned now. "Yeah, I'm fine, thank you." Eleanor walked out into the cold, shoved the ticket into her jacket pocket next to the apartment. Key she'd have to return to the landlord, and the final paycheck from the diner that would barely cover the bus fare.